Listen closely, because what I am about to say is not abstract. It is not some distant theory meant to titillate your mind. It is real, and it is suffocating the very fabric of your life. We live as Americans under a veil of illusion, a veil so insidious that most of us cannot even see it, cannot even feel the chains that wrap around us in silence. From the moment we are born, from the first toy we are given to the first lesson we are taught in school, we are trained to believe that comfort, safety, and security are tangible, attainable, achievable through a simple equation of work, wages, and consumption. But this equation is a lie. It is a carefully constructed mirage, a smoke and mirrors trick designed to blind you to the reality of your own subjugation. You work and you are told you are free. You pay your bills and you are told you are responsible. You accumulate wealth and you are told you are prosperous. Yet beneath this facade, beneath the polished veneer of the American dream, lies a system that thrives on your submission, that feeds on your unquestioning compliance. Do you feel it? That gnawing unease deep inside, the whisper in the back of your mind that tells you something is wrong, that you are not fully in control. That is your soul trying to speak over the roar of a system designed to keep you silent. The banks, those monolithic institutions, are not merely neutral conduits for currency. They are the architects of this illusion. They construct an environment where every choice you make, every purchase, every loan, every mortgage is orchestrated, subtly directed, constrained within a frame that ensures your dependence, your servitude, your acquiescence. They do not announce themselves as jailers. They do not parade their chains. No, their genius is in their invisibility. Their brilliance is in making you believe that the cage is merely an open-air garden, that the path you walk is your own, when every step has been measured, every turn calculated. And herein lies the tragedy: most Americans do not see the cage at all. They celebrate the bars, they polish the locks, they defend the very system that enslaves them, convinced that freedom lies somewhere outside, in the accumulation of what the banks permit them to possess. But freedom is not a credit card limit, freedom is not a stock portfolio, freedom is not a mortgage or a 401k or a retirement fund that exists only to bind you to a lifetime of labor and worry. True freedom, the kind that ignites the spirit and gives the heart its wings, is the reclamation of your autonomy, the awakening to the mechanisms that seek to control you, the refusal to bow to forces that feed on your fear, your ignorance, your distraction. We are lulled into a trance, into a collective stupor, by a society that worships consumption, that measures success in dollars rather than dignity, in acquisitions rather than agency. And while you sleep, while you chase the next pay stub, while you scroll endlessly through digital distractions, the banks sharpen their claws, tighten their grip, and write rules you will never see, interest rates you will never understand, obligations you cannot escape. They make you complicit in your own bondage. And the more you believe in the illusion, the more you embrace the lie, the deeper the chains sink into your wrists, into your mind, into your soul. This is not a call to anger alone. It is not merely a lecture on oppression. No, it is a summons to awaken. It is a call to recognize the spiritual dimension of your captivity, the way your soul has been quietly starved while your pockets have been drained. You must look beyond the numbers, beyond the contracts, beyond the polished offices and skyscrapers that gleam with the illusion of power. You must look within. You must ask yourself, how much of my life, of my spirit, of my agency, have I surrendered because I believed in a lie? How much of my freedom have I traded for comfort, for approval, for a fleeting sense of security that vanishes with the next interest hike, the next economic collapse, the next unseen hand that manipulates my existence? And in that reflection, in that confrontation with the truth, there is both despair and liberation. The despair is unavoidable, because once you see the veil, you cannot unsee it. You cannot step back into the ignorance that once protected you. But the liberation lies in acknowledgement, in recognition, in the willingness to fight back, not with violence, not with fury alone, but with clarity, with awareness, with the refusal to participate in a system designed to drain your essence. Once you lift the veil, once you see the chains for what they are, you reclaim the first fragments of your freedom. And freedom, once glimpsed, demands courage, demands action, demands a relentless pursuit of truth that no bank, no ledger, No institution can ever take away from you again. You are not a passive actor in this play. You are the witness. You are the resistor. You are the one called to awaken, to look directly into the machinery of control, to recognize its designs, and to declare that your soul, your mind, and your life will not be purchased, borrowed, or leased by those who profit from your submission. The veil of illusion is thin, fragile, and once pierced, it never returns. And once pierced, you begin to see the world, not as the banks would have you believe, but as it truly is, a battlefield for your spirit, a test of your courage, and an invitation to reclaim what has always been yours. Again, hear me, because the truth that follows is neither gentle nor forgiving, and it will demand that you confront what you have long avoided. The chains you glimpsed through the veil are not mere symbols, they are instruments of extraction. The banks do not simply take your money, they siphon your very sense of agency, your dignity, your capacity to imagine a life beyond servitude. Every loan, every interest payment, every financial product is meticulously designed to harvest more than currency. It harvests compliance, it harvests your soul. And yet, because the extraction is subtle, invisible to the naked eye, we fail to recognize it until the losses become catastrophic, until our freedom, our autonomy, our very identity has been quietly mortgaged without our consent. They have perfected the art of silent theft. You do not feel it as you surrender a fraction of your income each month, as you trust the promise of deferred security, as you chase the illusions of credit and convenience. But beneath the surface, your life is being mapped, your choices being predicted, your limits being defined by interests, fees, and rules that are never explained, only enforced. You are corralled into the illusion of abundance while the reality is extraction. Your labor, your sweat, your long hours, your moments of joy, they all flow through invisible channels to strengthen the bank's dominion. And you are told, if you dare to question it, that this is normal, that this is freedom, that this is the American way. But it is not freedom. It is theft, spiritual and material, quiet and insidious. And it does not stop with the currency you can see. No, the theft extends into the very way we perceive possibility, into the scope of our dreams, into the contours of what we allow ourselves to hope for. The banks cultivate fear and scarcity within us so that we make decisions not from vision, but from necessity. We learn to measure our lives in the narrow margins dictated by debt and interest, and in doing so, we surrender the expansiveness of imagination, the audacity of hope. Your ambitions, once vast and fiery, are channeled into the limited corridors of repayment schedules, credit limits, and calculated risk. You begin to live not for possibility, not for joy, but for survival within a system engineered to claim more than you can see, more than you can imagine. And yet, here is the terrifying elegance of their power. It is invisible because it does not need to be overt. The banks are not your enemy in a dramatic confrontation. They do not storm your home or brand you with iron. They work in silence, in shadows, in the language of legality and order, and because of this, we, the people, become complicit in our own plunder. We submit willingly because we are convinced that the system serves us, that it is rational, that it is necessary. And in our submission, we lose touch with the divine spark that should guide our courage and judgment, the intuitive awareness that knows when something is designed not to liberate, but to dominate. This silent theft has a spiritual dimension that cannot be ignored. When your life is consumed by worry over interest rates, by fear of default, by anxiety over money you do not yet possess, your spirit begins to wither. The theft is as much of your inner life as it is of your bank account. The capacity for contemplation, for empathy, for radical generosity, even for prayer, these are diminished when the machinery of extraction dictates the tempo of your existence. You become trapped in a rhythm not of your choosing, dictated by an institution whose only purpose is to increase its own power. And the deeper you sink into this pattern, the more invisible your chains become, until one day you awaken to find that your life has been quietly claimed, piece by a system that hides behind civility and legality, while it consumes the essence of who you are. And so, the call to awareness is urgent. You must examine not only the contracts, the fees, and the interest rates, but also the subtle erosion of your confidence, your autonomy, your capacity to dream. You must trace the paths of your compliance and confront the ways you have internalized the limits imposed upon you. For the bank's power is absolute only so long as it is unseen, only so long as it is unquestioned, only so long as it remains in the shadows of our consciousness. Once illuminated, once recognized, the machinery of silent theft falters because it relies on complicity, on ignorance, on the quiet acquiescence of those it subjugates. You are not powerless. You are not merely a passive victim of economic forces beyond your control. Recognition is the first act of defiance. Seeing the theft for what it is, naming it, feeling it, understanding it, this is the spark of liberation. The banks may have taken your money, but they do not have your conscience unless you surrender it. They may have shaped your choices, but they cannot define the limits of your imagination if you refuse to believe their narrative. They may have constructed a world of quiet extraction, but you are capable of reclaiming your agency, of piercing the shadow with awareness, of taking back the space within your mind, your heart, and your life that has been quietly stolen. The silent theft is brutal, and it is relentless, but it is not invincible. And in acknowledging its existence, in naming its subtle power, in refusing to participate in the deception any longer, you begin the long, difficult work of recovery, of reclaiming what was quietly taken, and of preparing yourself for the next step, an awakening not just of finances, but of the soul itself, and of preparing yourself for the next step, an awakening not just of finances, but of the soul itself. Because it is here, in this quiet space of recognition, that we confront the true crisis, the crisis within. It is a void that cannot be filled with money, with possessions, with fleeting distractions or hollow promises. It is a spiritual bankruptcy that mirrors the economic one, a desolation that erodes the core of our being, even as the banks siphon the lifeblood of our material existence. This crisis is not visible on any ledger, cannot be measured in interest rates or stock prices, yet it shapes the very decisions we make, the compromises we accept, the paths we follow. When the soul is impoverished, the heart is muted, the mind dulled, we surrender power without realizing it. We trade our vitality for comfort, our conscience for convenience, and our destiny for a system that thrives on our quiet acquiescence. Look around at the faces of those who have been consumed by this crisis. We see it in the anxious father, staring at a screen, calculating how to survive another month in a system that treats his labor as currency, not human worth. We see it in the young mother, exhausted, fearful, measuring her children's futures in financial terms, never in the magnitude of their potential. We see it in ourselves in moments when we hesitate to act, when we choose safety over integrity, when we let fear dictate the boundaries of our lives. And what is the source of this crisis? It is not some distant abstraction, not the banks alone, though they are instruments of its perpetuation. No, the source lies in the surrender of the soul to a culture that equates value with accumulation, identity with consumption, freedom with debt. We have been taught to fear scarcity as if it is natural law, as if it is an unchangeable force that defines the possibilities of our lives. But scarcity is a construct, a tool wielded by institutions that profit from our submission. The crisis within thrives on our acceptance of this lie. When we internalize scarcity, when we believe that we must claw our way forward within the narrow margins prescribed for us, we lose sight of the abundance that exists beyond the veil, the abundance that God, that conscience, that deeper truth provides. Our hearts shrink to fit the cages built around us, our courage is softened, our audacity dulled. And in this reduction of spirit, we become complicit in the systems that explode us because we lack the vision, the energy, the resolve to resist. And yet, it is precisely in acknowledging this crisis that we begin to reclaim our power. We must confront it directly, not flinch from the despair it evokes, not retreat into numbing distractions or false reassurances. We must stare into the void within ourselves and recognize the ways we have been emptied, the ways we have allowed our spirits to be mortgaged alongside our material lives. This is a brutal truth. No system outside of us can enslave us so long as the spirit remains unbroken. But the moment we surrender the inner life, the crisis is complete, and the chains outside find fertile soil within our own hearts. We must remember that this is a fight not merely for survival, but for integrity, for meaning, for the restoration of the self. Every dollar borrowed, every step constrained by financial obligation, every act of compliance without reflection, is a battle within, a surrender or a reclamation of our inner landscape, and this battle is existential. It asks, will we live by the dictates of fear, by the scripts written by others for profit and control, or will we reclaim the sacred ground of conscience, of vision, of belief that our lives belong not to ledgers but to our higher purpose? The crisis within is relentless, it is unforgiving, but it is also an invitation. It is a summons to awaken, to examine the depths of our hearts, to confront the shadows we have long ignored. This awakening demands courage that is spiritual, emotional, and intellectual. It demands that we no longer measure our lives in terms of what can be extracted, but in terms of what can be created, nourished, and defended. It requires honesty, the brutal kind that strips away comforting illusions and forces us to see ourselves as we truly are, beings capable of extraordinary courage, yet vulnerable to the slow erosion of our inner life if left unchecked. And it requires recognition that the external forces, banks, governments, societal pressures, are only powerful insofar as they find resonance within our own unresolved fears, our own unexamined compromises, our own lack of vigilance over the soul's health. The crisis within is thus both warning and revelation. It is the signal that our lives are out of balance, that our souls are tethered, that our freedom, real freedom, the freedom that transcends material accumulation, is imperiled. But it is also the moment when transformation becomes possible, when clarity emerges from despair, when the realization dawns that if we confront this crisis, if we refuse to surrender the inner life to fear and compliance, we can begin to dismantle the invisible structures of control piece by piece within ourselves. It is in this confrontation that the journey toward restoration begins, a journey that demands vigilance, courage, and the willingness to reclaim both our hearts and our lives from the forces that seek to dominate them. And it is here, in the depths of this confrontation with the inner void, that we discover the raw, unyielding power of intercession. Not the polite, perfunctory prayers that fill pews and pass unnoticed into the air, but the kind of prayer that demands reckoning, that shakes the very foundations of complacency, that calls forth divine justice into the dark corridors of human oppression. Intercession is not passive. It is not whispered in quiet desperation. It is a spiritual weapon, a reclamation of authority in a world that seeks to strip us of it. It is the articulation of resistance in its most profound, visceral, and transformative form. When we pray with full awareness, with the fire of righteous indignation and the humility of absolute dependence, we pierce the veils of illusion and confront the forces that enslave us, both seen and unseen. Every word, every breath, every cry offered in the spirit of intercession is a blow against the machinery that manipulates and controls us. The banks, the institutions, the structures of power that quietly siphon our freedom, they cannot exist in the same space where the soul rises in prayer, fully conscious, fully present, fully unafraid. Prayer, when wielded as intercession, is an act of defiance, a refusal to acquiesce to the systems that treat human life as a ledger entry, as an opportunity for extraction. It is a declaration that your spirit, your heart, your conscience cannot be bought, sold, or diminished by the cold calculus of interest rates and balance sheets. It is a confrontation that echoes across the corridors of power, unseen but undeniably real, shaking the foundations of every institution that depends on our ignorance, our fear, our silence. And yet, intercession is not only defiance, it is illumination. When we pray with intention, we begin to see clearly the structures that bind us. The veils that once obscured our perception of control, manipulation, and extraction dissolve in the heat of spiritual clarity. We recognize the subtle ways in which our lives have been constrained, the ways our decisions have been shaped by forces beyond our comprehension, and the quiet theft of our agency that accompanies every moment of blind compliance. The act of intercession transforms awareness into action, insight into reclamation. We no longer see the world as a passive landscape of inevitability, but as a battleground where every act of consciousness, every deliberate prayer, every assertion of spiritual authority chips away at the invisible chains that hold us. And there is another dimension, one that cannot be overstated. Intercession binds us to a power beyond ourselves. It is not merely the projection of will, it is communion with the divine, a channel through which justice, abundance, and liberation flow. The banks may wield influence over dollars, but they hold no sway over the higher currents of destiny that prayer can invoke. The act of intercession aligns us with a force that transcends the material and the temporal, that reaches into the structures of reality itself and begins to bend them toward justice. It restores a kind of balance, a recognition that the universe, God, however we name it, responds to those who are willing to stand in truth, to speak from the depths of their souls, to demand that the light be brought into the dark corners where greed and oppression hide. Intercession is also an awakening, both personal and collective. When we pray in this conscious, fiery, uncompromising way, we awaken not only our own spirit, but also the latent consciousness of others. The ripple effects of such prayer cannot be contained. They challenge the complacency of communities, confront the numbing power of systemic control, and demand accountability in ways that bureaucracy, legislation, or protest alone cannot achieve. The act of intercession transforms the individual into a conduit of power that moves beyond the self, connecting the personal struggle with the cosmic imperative for justice, freedom, and moral courage. And yet this power is not easy to harness. It demands courage, intensity, and the willingness to face not only external oppression, but also the darkness within ourselves. We must confront our own doubts, our own fears, our own complicity in systems that exploit us, because the prayer that carries transformative power is born of honesty, not pretense, of urgency, not ritual, of fire, not convenience. The intercessor must stand in the rawness of truth, stripped of illusions, willing to confront both the forces that bind us and the weaknesses that allow us to be bound. Only then does prayer become an instrument of liberation, a declaration that we will not be passive in the face of domination, a claim of authority that asserts my spirit is not for sale, my freedom is not negotiable, my life is not subject to the quiet theft of others' ambition. So understand, this intercession is not optional. In a world designed to extract from us everything but compliance, prayer is the act that reclaims what is ours by right, our agency, our vision, our soul. It is the spark that ignites resistance, the light that reveals the machinery of control, the call that awakens courage. And those who dare to intercede with full awareness and uncompromising intensity find themselves transformed. The system trembles not because it fears violence, but because it cannot survive in the presence of souls that will not yield, hearts that will not bow, and voices that demand justice beyond the ledger and beyond the ledger keepers. And it is here, in the crucible of intercession, that the reckoning of truth emerges, inevitable, uncompromising, and devastating in its clarity. The systems that have quietly manipulated, coerced, and drained the lifeblood of millions cannot withstand the light once it is fully turned upon them. The banks, the financial institutions, the faceless architects of debt and dependency. They rely on obscurity, on the comfort of ignorance, on the silence of the oppressed. But truth is relentless. It cannot be contained. It seeps into every crack, it penetrates every defense, and it exposes the mechanisms of control with an unyielding precision that leaves no place for evasion or pretense. This reckoning is not a gentle revelation. It is not a polite disclosure that allows you to continue as if nothing has changed. It is a violent confrontation with reality, the kind that shakes the foundations of your beliefs, your assumptions, your certainties. You begin to see the ledger not merely as a tool of commerce, but as a weapon of domination. You see the contracts, the interest rates, the hidden fees, and the invisible strings that guide your life in ways you never consented to, never imagined, never even suspected. And when you see it, there is no turning back. The veil is lifted, and the truth demands action. It demands awareness, it demands courage, because once you know, ignorance is no longer an option. The reckoning of truth is also deeply personal. It is not just the exposure of external systems, but the confrontation with your own complicity, your own acquiescence, your own silence in the face of oppression. How many hours, how many days, how many years have you surrendered to routines that reinforce the very systems that seek to control you? How many moments of courage were deferred because comfort seemed safer than confrontation? How often have you measured your life not by vision, not by purpose, but by the false metrics imposed upon you, credit scores, loan approvals, bank balances, while the true cost, the cost to your freedom, your spirit, your dignity, went unnoticed? The truth demands that you answer these questions with brutal honesty, because without acknowledgement, without confrontation, there can be no liberation. And yet, the reckoning is not merely about despair. It is not a lamentation over what has been stolen or squandered. It is, paradoxically, the gateway to empowerment. For once the truth is fully seen, fully recognized, the illusions that sustained your subjugation lose their power. The banks, the institutions, the architects of economic control, they are formidable only so long as you remain blind. Once you name the mechanisms of manipulation, once you recognize the ways in which your life has been channeled, constrained, and corralled, you reclaim the first fragments of freedom. Knowledge becomes action, perception becomes defiance, awareness becomes the fuel for resistance, and this resistance is not symbolic, it is not theoretical, it is tangible, immediate, and transformative. When the truth is exposed, when the mechanisms of control are illuminated, choices emerge that were previously invisible. Paths open that were previously blocked. You begin to act with clarity, not desperation. You begin to reclaim resources, both material and spiritual, that were quietly drained from you. You begin to demand accountability from the institutions that profited from your submission. You begin to see that liberation is not a distant fantasy, but a responsibility that begins within the mind and flows outward into action, conscience, and community. The reckoning of truth also carries with it a moral imperative. It is not enough to see. Seeing without acting is complicity. Witnessing without confronting is surrender. Once the chains are revealed, the architecture of deception laid bare, you are called to respond, not with fear, not with resignation, but with deliberate, courageous engagement. To do nothing is to remain tethered to a system designed to exploit you. To act is to reclaim the spiritual and material sovereignty that has been quietly denied for too long. This is the confrontation that separates the passive from the awakened, the enslaved from the liberated, the spiritually bankrupt from the whole and awakened human being. And so, the truth must be faced. It is painful. It is uncomfortable. It is morally and emotionally exhausting. But it is also the only path to genuine freedom, the only doorway through which the soul can breathe, through which the spirit can rise, through which the individual can reclaim their rightful power. Once the veils are torn away, once the shadows are illuminated, once the silent manipulations are exposed, the American people, and indeed any human being subject to these invisible chains, begin to understand the breadth of their oppression and the magnitude of their potential liberation. The reckoning of truth is brutal, it is demanding, and it is glorious, for it heralds the first moment in which submission is no longer possible and resistance, awakened and informed, becomes inevitable. Once the truth is seen, it burns. It does not gently illuminate. It scorches the lies we built our comfort upon. And from those ashes, from that raw and painful clarity, begins the overflow of divine justice. For there comes a moment in every great reckoning when the balance must be restored, when the hand of the divine reaches into the chaos we created and declares that enough has been taken, enough has been stolen, enough has been lost. This is not the justice of men measured, compromised, and traded like currency, but the justice of a God who sees the oppression of his people, who hears the silent cries behind closed doors, who knows the weight that the bankers and profiteers have placed on the backs of the weary. And when that divine justice moves, it is not subtle, it is not the tinkling of coins or the quiet balancing of ledgers. It is the flood. It is the sound of walls breaking, of illusions shattering, of systems trembling under the weight of their own corruption. The banks, those temples of greed, built on exploitation and sanctified by false promises, cannot withstand the flood. Every hidden scheme, every buried manipulation, every deceitful policy crafted in the shadows is brought into the light. What was built on deception must crumble, and what was rooted in injustice must fall. For God does not bless what destroys the human soul. He does not sustain what feeds upon despair. He will not abide systems that crush the spirit under the weight of debt and disguise it as progress. But divine justice is not only destruction, it is restoration, it is the reordering of what has been broken, the reawakening of what has been numbed, the renewal of what has been forgotten. The overflow is not merely the end of oppression, it is the return of abundance, the restoration of dignity, the rediscovery of truth. When the people awaken, when they rise in the awareness of their worth, when they begin to pray not as beggars, but as heirs of divine inheritance, something shifts in the spiritual order. The currents that once carried wealth and power upward into the vaults of those who manipulate begin to reverse. What was stolen begins to return, what was withheld begins to flow, and those who once bowed their heads in quiet submission stand upright, eyes clear, hearts fierce, unafraid. This overflow is not just financial, it is spiritual, moral, collective. It is the moment when humanity rediscovers that the greatest wealth is not in possessions, but in the unyielding power of conscience. It is when we understand that prosperity without justice is decay, and that security without integrity is rot. Divine justice demands a transformation that begins not in the marketplace but in the heart. It is the restoration of moral balance, the recentering of what is sacred, the recognition that every economic act is also a spiritual one. You cannot serve both God and greed. You cannot build freedom on exploitation. You cannot call a system moral when it rewards deception and punishes truth. So, what happens when this divine justice overflows? It begins with awakening, one soul at a time, one conscience reclaiming its voice, one person refusing to live as an instrument of someone else's control. The flood of justice begins in whispers, an awakening within homes, within conversations, within the quiet recognition that life must mean more than survival. And then it grows, it becomes movement, it becomes resistance, it becomes the unstoppable tide of people reclaiming their God-given dignity. They will no longer be reduced to consumers or debtors or statistics in a banker's equation. They will become witnesses to truth, carriers of justice, participants in the divine act of restoration. But understand this, it will not come without cost. Justice never does. The systems that built their power on lies will resist. The voices that profited from deception will howl. They will call this awakening dangerous. They will call it rebellion. They will call it madness. But the truth, once awakened, cannot be silenced. The soul, once liberated, cannot be enslaved again. Divine justice is not a transaction, it is transformation. It remakes the world from the inside out, tearing away every false structure, every idol of greed, every illusion of power that stood against the moral law of the universe. And in that transformation, you will feel it within you, around you, through you, the quiet but overwhelming assurance that God has not abandoned his people. That he never will. That in every generation, when the powerful grow arrogant and the oppressed grow weary, there comes a moment when heaven itself intervenes. The overflow begins where human control ends. It is not granted to the deserving, nor withheld from the fallen. It comes to those who hunger for truth, who refuse to bow, who dare to believe that faith and courage can still move mountains. So stand in that overflow. Let it wash away the fear that the system has bred into you. Let it cleanse the lies you've been taught about your worth, your power, your place. Let it remind you that your soul cannot be purchased, that your freedom is not theirs to give or take. And as you rise, steadfast, defiant, awake, remember this: no institution, no government, no bank can stand against the force of a people aligned with divine truth. For when God's justice overflows, every wall built on deception must fall, and every chain forged by greed must break. And in that breaking, in that falling, humanity breathes again, free, restored, and radiant in the light of a justice that no power on earth can silence.